Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Short. I'm the Artistic Director at the Wilbury Group, and I'm here with Barnaby Evans, Artistic Director and Co-CEO of WaterFire Providence, and Brandon Marshall, Epidemiologist at Brown University School of Public Health, who's appeared on our Reopening Rhode Island series, talking about some of the public health issues facing theaters as we look to reopen. Together, we've been working on this new project, Decameron Providence, which we're very excited to share with you. And we've taken a lot of precautions, taken a lot of advice from Brandon and the Department of Health on how to put it together safely. And we wanted to share some of those precautions with you. So Barnaby, maybe you could share our audience a little bit about some of the precautions that we've taken towards the overall vision of a safe event that's focused on public health and safety.
Thank you, Josh. This has been a really exciting project, and I've learned a lot working with everyone, particularly Brandon, and some of the health issues. As everyone knows, with COVID-19, the arts have really been in a hiatus, and actors aren't acting, and museums aren't open, and we're all staying home and going crazy. But art is very often the lens by which we process things that change and think about the change in the world. And we've certainly got political things happening. We've got equity issues. We've got Black Lives Matter. We've got so much going on, the climate crisis. And often art is some of the ways we get better perspectives and learn more. And it occurred to me that public health is also how the community learns more and gets better and takes care of itself. And in fact, public health is very often storytelling of its own kind of that this historically happened and this happened and we tried this and this was the outcome and things like that. And so Josh and Wilbury and WaterFire have been collaborating on a number of different projects, including the Fringe we've been doing for a few years. And we wanted to try something that would allow some of the great voices in our arts community to have an experimental way where we could figure out how we could do this with safety as being the paramount goal here. Because we see art as something that strengthens the community, so you've also got to make sure it's done in a safe manner. And we've just started to try to reinvent what that might be. And for example, one of the first things we did was we got rid of the theater altogether. Not the acting, but the actual building, and do it all outside. And that's the sort of thing that we're going to be discussing here today on how we've really reimagined what the experience will be. So A, it'll be fun, but primarily it'll be safe. And C, you'll be learning new voices and meeting new artists. And I think it's going to be a really a magical time, but also a powerful evening of theater.
That's awesome, Barnaby. Thanks. And actually, let me back up just a little bit for anybody who doesn't know what the Decameron is, which I did not know when it was first brought up. So Wilbury had been talking to WaterFire. We've been having a couple of conversations about how to collaborate on something to, get theater up and running again. Our space, while spacious, is not something that's large enough for us to produce a show indoors. And WaterFire has its giant, beautiful art center. And we had originally started talking about putting something in there, actually. And out of those conversations, talking to our resident playwright, Darcy Denigan, she brought up the idea of the Decameron by Boccaccio, which was written in 1348 at towards the tail end of the Black Plague in Europe. And I had actually never heard of this book before. I know that Barnaby and Brandon had as a health professional and as a well-read artist, but not me. So it takes place over 14 days outside the city of Florence. And it's about these 10 young people who quarantine themselves in the countryside, and they spend these 14 days together. And they put aside 2 days for prayer, 2 days for chores, and then 10 days for storytelling. And every one of those 10 days, each of them tells a story. So there's 10 stories a day for 10 days. So, Darcy had this brilliant idea. We brought it to WaterFire. WaterFire was like, let's do it. Definitely, as we talked about it, it definitely seemed like doing it outside and spreading it out over the campus between WaterFire and the nearby Alco building was going to be the safest way to do it. And we put together this about 12 artists ended up coming on board to occupy these 10 performance spaces spread out all over this. So that's what Decameron is. And as Barnaby mentioned, it's all outside, and we've been working to make this as safe for our audience and for the artists participating as possible. And this includes things like limiting the size of the audience. It includes advanced ticketing as opposed to walk-up ticketing, and all sorts of things. So Barnaby, did I capture Decameron well enough?
Well, I think very well. The only thing I'd add is the original was is significant in literature because it was the voice of the people. It wasn't gods and goddesses and heroes and kings and queens. This was the individual citizens of the community, of from lower class to upper middle class, and that they were also looking critically at their society and what was wrong. Often they're quite funny, sometimes they're quite scathing. They had lots of complaints of how, poor leadership and where it can lead you. And it just seemed that there were so many new vital voices in our community right now that were starting to talk about stuff, but we didn't have those forums where they often would be there. So the combination of coming up with a new forum to tell those stories that looks back at this period in 1348 when the whole community was impacted by a pandemic, with so much we need to talk about now, and making it an opportunity and then figuring out how to do it safely just seemed like a really worthwhile project.
So how are we going to do it safely? Who wants to start?
Well, Brandon is our expert, but I mean, the first thing we did was we said, we're going to do this all outside. And Brandon, tell us why that's so important, because that's a key part of what we're thinking here.
Sure, Barnaby, that's right. So we've learned over the last 6 months from studying COVID-19 and the virus causes that causes that disease, that outdoor settings are much safer. And that's due to a couple of reasons. The virus survives in small droplets that we expel when we cough or sneeze or even project or sing. And when we're inside, those droplets tend to hang in the air a lot longer. And so then when an uninfected person walks through that cloud of droplets, that's when they're at high risk for becoming infected. And then there's also some evidence too that the virus is sensitive. It needs to be, in some of these water droplets to survive. Outside, when it's hot, there's sunshine, those droplets dry up on surfaces and the virus dies rather quickly. It just doesn't survive very long in those environments compared to indoors. So that's why we've seen a lot of recommendations to move activities outdoors, and why I think it's really smart and the safe thing to do to hold this event entirely in an outdoor setting.
And what's fascinating is in 1348, they were also following guidance for pandemics of their day. And one of the first did in the novel, which they were told to do, was to get out of the density of Florence, out into the countryside. And they don't go into the villa. They spend their time in the gardens and the outside and the fields and the rivers, streams surrounding, and spend their time outside. So it's fascinating. We want to use the evening to help explain and talk about why we're outside, not just do it, but also help the audience understand why we do it, so that they'll be best informed as they think about the other exposures they might have in their lives.
Yeah, and let's talk about one of the other things actually that I think is good. Besides moving it outside, you guys came up with this idea of splitting the entire production into basically 2 different productions, or 2 different festivals is what we're saying. There's 5 stages on one side, 5 stages on another, and both the audience and the artists that attend each of these stages never intersect. Is that right?
That's right. And that came about from the realization that an evening at the theater was going to involve time to see 5 of the 10 stories. And we hope they're going to buy a ticket and come back on another night. But then realizing that was an opportunity. The more we can make groups smaller and exposures less, and make that part of the structure. You could do the 5 stages here and the 5 stages here and have people wandering between the two, but it'd be much smarter and much safer to say, yeah, they're a block apart, but and the same night, but actually we're going to completely cleave them into a West Festival and an East Festival, and you're going to have your own entrance and your own parking lots, and you're not even going to see that 50% of the audience. All of those steps is being done to keep safety foremost.
And that also makes contact tracing much easier, doesn't it? Which seems like one of the most important things that we're finding. Isn't that right, Brandon?
That's correct, Josh. And that's something the governor often says, is keep track of who you're interacting with, so that if you do come down with COVID-19, the Department of Health will contact you and ask for that information, so then they can do what's called contact tracing, which is going out and talking to your contacts, your potential exposures around their risk. They can be tested, they can self-isolate themselves to avoid onwards transmission. So by keeping the number of people we're interacting with in these kinds of events small, that reduces the risk of transmission, as Barnaby mentioned, but also makes some of that contact tracing a lot easier, because there's a lot fewer people to keep track of in an evening, if you will.
Yeah. And what else, the other things that we're doing? Oh, Barnaby?
That the same idea then gets into the idea of the brigades. We're going to divide the audience, or overall we're dividing the audience into 10 separate brigades, and we use that word because that's novel. The woman who organized the 7 women and the 3 men to go off in the countryside called it the Gentle Brigade. And we're going to divide the audience into 10 groups. 5 of them will be in the West Festival, 5 of them will be in the East Festival. But within that brigade, that's all you're going to see that evening. We're going to have a captain of the brigade who have stepped out of the pages of the novel, and they're going to be your leader and your sort of explainer, but also your guide and your resource person. And they'll be keeping an eye on making sure we're keeping proper 6-foot distances and people have their masks on and things like that. But that way we've taken an audience that is out together and enjoying an evening, but there may be somewhere from 10 to 20 people in that brigade. So once again, and many of those people will be coming as a household. So that may just be 10 households. All of these things add to both the reduction of exposure, increase the safety, and helps with contact tracing and management of the event.
Definitely, for both for the audience and the artist too, right? Who are also putting themselves out there. But there's a lot of science behind how we're placing the artists, isn't that right? Brandon, can you tell us a little bit about some of the recommendations around artists and the distance that they should be from the audience? For example, an actor or storyteller?
Sure, Josh. So we've all heard of the 6-foot recommendation, which is typically how far the virus might travel in the air when we sneeze or cough in droplets. So as Barnaby mentioned, all of the audience members will be separated and will be asked to adhere to those guidelines. What we've learned, though, is the amount of droplets that you produce and how far they can travel is proportional to how loud you speak and how much projecting you're doing. And there are cases too of transmission beyond 6 feet in some settings where people were singing, like a choral practice in Seattle was an early example where we had a lot of transmission in a singing environment. So the recommendation is to extend that distance between the artists who are projecting loudly or singing and the audience members, just to ensure that the likelihood of transmission is, you know, nil to 0. So that's something important that, again, I think is done to keep the audience and the artists safe.
Brandon, that distance, if they're projecting, is 14 feet. And that's something that we will be building into, not only into our presentation, but we'll be marketing it on the stage and in the seating areas. So it'll be a constant reminder that this is the procedure we're following.
Right, as well as all of the artists will undergo some COVID safety training before the performances start. In addition to each of these brigada leaders will all have to undergo the same training to make sure that they're monitoring the audience so that everyone is safe. Brandon, we have some musicians playing in the show, for example. If I'm, a violinist, for example, would they need to also be 14 feet away? Do they need to wear a mask if they're playing a violin? Sort of what are the rules or best practices for artists who may not necessarily be projecting their voices?
I think in those circumstances, I would be less concerned. I think we were talking earlier about instruments, wind instruments, trombones, trumpets. That's potentially where you could see some of that transmission occur over a farther distance. And so I think it probably, Josh, depends on actually the instrument that's played. If we're talking about guitars, drums, violins, probably not, and that the risk of transmission there is really quite low or no greater than someone who's talking. So but we want to add those extra precautions on for people who are projecting loudly, singing, or playing wind instruments. Yeah.
That's good. And we've put together a really amazing group of artists for this. And some of these artists have actually been in the same pod with each other. They live together, they're partners one way or the other. How important is it that they practice social distancing from each other if they've been living together?
Probably not, Josh. Most of us live with others in a household setting where we're around individuals frequently. And so, that is not going to be any different in this type of event as well. So I think at the Decameron, you'll see people in smaller groups, subgroups that are people who live together or who are, as you said, in each other's bubbles or pods. And that's done, again, for safety reasons and to reduce transmission to people that they're not interacting with very, very frequently.
Cool. The other day, the governor announced that she was moving us back to a 15-person limit for social gatherings. What does that mean for us producing this event?
I'm glad you asked that, Josh. I was thinking about that earlier today when I saw the governor's press conference. I wanted to clarify that by social gatherings, what that's referring to are informal events, barbecues, baby showers, house parties. That's actually where we're seeing some of the increased transmission right now. Some of the increases in cases are being linked to those kind of events. And why is that? Well, that's because those are environments where, people are not really following the rules. They're getting fairly close together. They're not wearing masks. Some may be indoors, and those are all higher risk settings. And so what I think we're seeing is now a reduction in the number of people that can congregate in a social gathering. What the Decameron is something quite different, right? It's a large outdoor event where physical distancing, masking, and other safety measures will be in place. And in those settings, we know that the transmission is much, much lower. A good example, that we can point to are many of the protests that occurred after the killing and murder of. There's no scientific evidence actually that those protests led to increased COVID transmission. And that was because of the vast majority, people were compliant with wearing masks. Again, the events were outdoors. And so we didn't see cases linked to those outdoor protests. Where we are seeing new cases arise as a result of these, smaller social gatherings where people are close together, not wearing masks and spending a lot of time in each other's presence.
And Brandon, that phrase social, I think it's things like weddings and baby showers, which involve a lot of and bringing people over to meet people and, oh, I haven't seen you in so long time, and there's more touching and and alcohol and dancing
Right.
and all of that stuff, it contributes. Am I correct in that? So why she calls it a social gathering?
Definitely, that's exactly it, Barnaby. And so, those kinds of activities, I know we all want to engage in. We need to be in touch with each other, contact each other, but those are the higher risk moments for COVID-19 transmission.
Brendan, I'm curious about the transfer of these droplets or COVID in general through, I don't know what the phrase is, touched objects. I mean, some artists have asked about handing out programs at the event, that sort of thing. What kind of risk does that present? I mean, how often is transference happening that way, through me handing you a piece of paper and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so what we're learning with this virus is that transmission through objects, what scientists and doctors called fomites, is actually pretty rare. There's only a handful of anecdotal reports out there that suggest that that was the mode of transmission. By far more common would be, again, these droplets and aerosols. Early on, there were some laboratory studies that showed the virus could survive on surfaces for hours, for up to 24 hours. What we know now, though, is that those were not really, those were experimental conditions. They don't actually replicate what happens in the real world. And the dose of the virus that scientists are putting on these surfaces was much, much higher than is typically seen in reality. So in fact, although that was concerning, what we know now is that fomite transmission, or transmission through contaminated surfaces, is in fact rare. Now, that being said, we still want to adhere to good cleaning practices. Hand washing is very important. So we should still, engage in those practices, and they are important. But more critical at this point, I would say, is social distancing and masking that addresses the dominant mode of COVID transmission, which are droplets and aerosols.
That's great. Thank you, Brandon. And that brings up, the way that the knowledge around COVID-19 has been changing has sort of been a surprise for common people who don't live in the world of disease study and that sort of thing. It seems like every day that there's first don't wear a mask and then do wear a mask, and it can be transferred through objects and that sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about the scientific process that leads to these kind of changes? Is that too broad of a question?
No, let me tackle that, because this has been a major issue as we were discussing with COVID-19. What we do as scientists is we tackle a problem, we put forward a hypothesis, the evidence and the result may confirm that hypothesis, we move forward, or it may not, and then we have to change our hypothesis and change our understanding given those new or unexpected results that we see. So that is why we are seeing changes in some of these recommendations.
And Brandon, I just wanted to point out, when the hypothesis is disproved, you're still learning. That's not failure. You just learn not what you expected. So it's a process of constantly looking at the data, reevaluating your position, and moving forward.
Exactly, and that results in policies and recommendations that change. A great example is with masking. I told Josh recently, my father was actually on one of the cruise ships in Asia in January in Hong Kong, and I was telling him at that time, don't worry about a mask. It's probably not that effective. And that was because my understanding at that time in January was that this virus operated very much like SARS, which emerged in 2003, where by far transmission happened when people were very, very sick, when they were highly symptomatic. What we know now with COVID-19 is that in fact, the majority of transmissions probably occur in people that have no symptoms at all, or are pre-symptomatic, or right before they start getting that fever or cough. So that's why masking is so important, is because we might not even know that we're sick and at risk of transmitting it to others. If we're wearing the mask, that reduces that chance. And so as we learn more about the virus, we've had to, change the recommendations to follow the evolving science.
There was another aspect about the mask that originally they were very concerned that for doctors and nurses in high density settings, when we had a shortage of masks, they were looking at a very particular type of mask. And they were afraid that if I wasn't so sure they were saying not to wear masks, but that the N95 masks workers.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct, Barnaby. Yeah, and now we know that cloth coverings also work quite well, not as well as those medical masks or N95s, but now that we've done those studies, we can be sure that any kind of face covering is effective and does greatly reduce the risk of transmission.
And that brings us to something else that we've mentioned, but I just wanted to emphasize is we're requiring that everyone who comes and everyone who performs and volunteers and staff and performers will all be masked. And that's part of the way we keep the entire community safe.
That's right, Barnaby. We're learning that masking is just so critical. There's been a couple of good examples that I think illuminate why it works so well. There was a study that the CDC did looking at two hairstylists in Missouri who were both infected with COVID-19, but they were wearing masks consistently, and so were the clients. And so when the CDC tested over 100 clients who had contact with those contagious hairstylists, there was actually no transmission at all, despite the fact that those clients had been in pretty close proximity to the hairstylists. And so, we're seeing more and more examples of cases where masks really do make a difference. They greatly reduce the risk of transmission, even when people are in close proximity to each other.
And, there's this debate about whether masks are an impingement on your freedom or whether they're a statement of your concern for the community as a whole. And I think it's pretty clear, the science is clear that you can breathe fine and you can express yourself fine wearing a mask, but that mask is very valuable to protecting the health of the entire community.
What about the pre-screen questions that, if you go to a restaurant for dining, they've been asking, have you been in contact with anybody who has had symptoms? Have you had any of the following symptoms? For the Decameron, every audience member will need to answer these pre-screen questions. And if they fail the test, they won't be allowed in. We'll ask them.
And also, I think that's true audience member, staff, volunteer, and performer, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. How effective is that proving? I mean, does that sort of keep things safe?
I think it's important, Josh, but I would also encourage folks to self-monitor, right? If you buy tickets and you're not feeling well that evening, I strongly encourage you to reconsider attending because of this issue that most people are at their peak contagiousness right before symptoms occur or right during their onset. So in that first day, say, of experiencing a cough or fever. So best to be on the safe side. If you're starting to experience any of the symptoms of COVID-19, reconsider attending that evening. And maybe coming back another day if those symptoms resolve. So in addition to the screening and then just asking audience members to self-monitor, I think those are important steps we can take to keep the event safe for everyone.
And that is built into the policy so that your refund is automatic. We really want to make it absolutely barrier-free for you to follow the right path.
Absolutely. Well, what else, Barnaby? What else, Brandon? What else have we?
Well, the thing I'd love to talk about is that the mask really is turning out to have been probably the most important thing to implement, that and outdoors, and that's right at the heart of what we're doing.
Yep.
And Brandon, you had mentioned earlier that sometimes the public can get fixated on overly worried about things that are not quite as critical. And you talked about new concepts that people were talking about compared to James Fallows's concept of security theater, and I think you called it hygiene theater. Is that what it was? It was fascinating because I think we're in this place where we need to figure out how to safely open up the community and open up the economy, and masking seems to be a real key to that. But also we're all somewhat insecure, and the sense that what we wanted to do was we wanted to follow the science to get to the passion that the art had. So what's the science saying about where our fears may be misplaced? For a while there, we were taking everyone's temperatures, and now they feel that's not so helpful.
Right, great, great comment, Barnaby. I think as we learn more, we are learning that fomite transmission, transmission from touching contaminated objects is just not that common. And so that doesn't mean that we should abandon all of our cleaning protocols and hand washing procedures. We should certainly do them, but we shouldn't become sort of obsessed with hyper cleaning and spending resources on extreme cleaning procedures when those resources could be spent better elsewhere. So that's a good example, I think, of where some of our concerns might be misplaced, and that will probably continue to evolve as well, right? As we've been saying, we learn more and more about this virus every day, and so these policies recommendations will continue to change. But we've learned a lot already about this virus, and I'm feeling confident that this event is going to ensure the highest level of health and safety for everyone, for the audience and for the artists that are participating.
That's great, Brandon. Well, we really appreciate all your insight and advice as we've put this thing together, because there's no way we could have done it without you. So thank you for that.
Thank you both. I'm a huge fan of WaterFire and Wilbury, and so I jumped at the opportunity to help out and look forward to participating with myself and seeing some of the phenomenal artists that are going to be featured at the Decameron. So thank you both for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you very much. Great.
All right. Thanks, guys. Let's get to work, I guess.
Thank you both.
All right. Bye.